I want to start with the thought exercise. I want you to picture the Amazon basin. What does it look like? Well, for some, it might be the sort of iconic image of the Andes overlooking the jungle. For others, it might be these iconic species of the forest. Still for others, the Amazon might be the last vestige of untouched cultures in the world. Or for some, it might be natural resource extraction, with the accompanying social and environmental damage that can ultimately lead to social unrest and violence. Well, the reality is the Amazon's all of these things. And they're incredibly connected in complex ways such that change in one aspect of the system ripples across the rest of the system. And when we layer on the laws, the institutions, and the policies that constrain and shape these dynamics, the system gets incredibly, incredibly complex. All this means that if you're an organization interested in, say, conserving biodiversity and ensuring ecological integrity, to make progress on those fronts, you might actually need to work on livelihoods programs, or indigenous community outreach, or perhaps extractive industry governance, maybe even conflict prevention. In other words, in order to make progress on your specialized goals, you need to generalize your programs and projects. Now, an organization that knows this need to specialize and generalize incredibly well is the Amazon Conservation Association, or ACA. Since the late 90s, ACA has been working across Peru to conserve some of the world's most ecologically important forests. And they've been doing this by specializing in tropical ecology, landscape conservation, and protected area management. But across their 15 years of work, they've come to understand that making progress on those fronts really requires working deeply with stakeholders on things like livelihoods programs, technical capacity building, governance. Now, Peru is an economic success story. With a history of conflict in the 1980s, poverty and reform in the 1990s, the new millennium has seen Peru rise to become one of Latin America's fastest growing and strongest economies. But that growth and that prosperity has come with a heavy price. And over the last 10 years, we've seen nearly 300% increases in conflict related to natural resources across Peru. All that means that conservation is simultaneously more important from an ecological perspective and more divisive from an economic and political perspective. And so conservation organizations are caught at the forefront of conflict. In that context, ACA took the strategic but risky decision to engage directly in conflict management. And they've done this by working with stakeholders to understand how their conservation projects are impacted by conflict in the region. Also, they've been looking at how their conservation projects might inadvertently be driving conflict in the region. And importantly, they've been looking for opportunities to use environmental management as a tool for peace building. And they've been successful in this. To date, they've incorporated conflict sensitivity into many of their programs and their projects. And they've received international funding to expand their conflict-sensitive work across the region, working with local communities, industry, and government. And the idea that they have is that by building regional capacity for conflict prevention, the system's better prepared to make progress on maintaining ecological integrity and conserving biodiversity. The question, though, for ACA is, what's the impact of this? Is this strategy working? Is it worth it? Well, that's a difficult question to answer, in part because whether it's in environmental work, whether it's in peace-building work, or development work, we typically don't collect the information necessary to tell us what's happening in a system. Rather, we measure specific progress toward our pre-specified objectives. In this case, how many acres of forest are conserved, how many species are saved. What we don't collect data on is what's happening in the rest of the system. How are our interventions affecting legal frameworks, affecting livelihoods, affecting markets? By not collecting information on those dynamics, we may be missing important dynamics that are emerging that could later undercut our ability to make progress on our original goals. And why do we do this? Why don't we collect the right sort of data to tell us what's going on in a system? Well, because it's difficult, and it's costly. Costly in terms of time, in terms of human capital, and financial resources. So if we look at how we traditionally monitor a project, we look at what activities we're engaging in an area. We ask what the outputs of those activities are. Then we measure what the outcomes of those outputs are and ask, are we making progress toward our pre-specified objectives? And funding structures support this. Most donors are interested in tracing the impact of their financial investments across a project cycle, but they're not willing to invest in data collection for other parts of the system, for ancillary things. So how do we overcome this challenge? Well, if we come back to the Amazon Conservation Association, they've taken another risky but strategic choice to invest in systemic impact assessment. Look at their conflict prevention work. They've got a traditional monitoring and evaluation framework that enables them to give the donor the information the donor needs to trace the impact of their financial investment. In addition, though, ACA's taking a layered approach to impact assessment, and they're building learning systems to help inform them on how the capacity building project is impacting their beneficiaries. Are they building capacity? Is the capacity being implemented? Next, they're building systems to help them understand what's going on across the region. How are social networks changing? What's happening to social networks and social relationships among all stakeholders? Finally, they're building learning systems to ask, what's this doing to their organizational capacity? They're a conservation organization. They're not a conflict prevention organization. So how does engaging in conflict prevention work either augment or undermine their conservation capacity? Now, it's a long way to go from building a learning system to implementing that system and then feeding that data back into their projects and the program cycle. But ACA believes that by building capacity for conflict management across the region, the system's primed to make real progress toward biodiversity conservation and ensuring ecological integrity. Because they know that by treating the system as a system, by engaging the system as a system, they're better poised to understand the system. And when we look at this place as a living, breathing system, it doesn't make sense to treat it any other way. No piece of this is discrete. Rather, every piece of this system depends on every other piece to survive and to thrive. And I believe very firmly that if we follow ACA's example, if we invest in systemic interventions, if we invest in systemic impact assessment, then we can make real progress toward building peace and conserving these incredibly important ecosystems across time. Thank you.